Easy wood grain texture. UV mapping can be intimidating to learn, but here is a quick trick that works on lots of wood and some stone objects. I'll start with the ico-sphere from my last video, and I'll turn it into a carved wooden ball. I'm going to change to the UV editing workspace. These a bunch of buttons up here are workspaces, but what they are just organizations of the screen, and the UV editing one has the 3D viewport area on the right, and it has the UV mapping area on the left, which still has that Dymaxion mapping that we get by default when we make any ico-sphere. But we're going to throw away this UV mapping and make a new one, and it's actually very easy. Over in the 3D viewport, there's a menu called UV, and it has all kinds of interesting tools for making UV maps, and we'll learn how to use all of those some other time. The one we're going to use today is called Project from View with Bounds. You click on that, and it takes the view, the direction that you're looking at your object at the moment, and it kind of squashes it flat and then stretches it to fit in your texture map, and it turns that into a UV map. And it turns out you're done. You have just made a new and a very useful UV map. Well, you're not quite done. You have to export this object now as a collada file. There are a bunch of parameters for collada file, but we'll talk about them some other time. I'm going to save them in a folder named OpenSim. I'm going to call this UV map wood ball. And now let's go in world and look at our ball. Let's load it in world. I'm going to upload a mesh model from a folder named OpenSim. I called it wood ball. There are a lot of parameters we could set, but they aren't important for what we're doing today. I'm going to change the texture. Going to make sure the color is white. And I have a texture called zebra wood, which has a very dark grain in it. And as you can see, this ball now has a very nice texture. I don't know if you can tell, but there's a certain pattern on one side of the sphere, and you'll see a similar pattern on the opposite side. Because the texture has been projected through the shape, and so the ball kind of looks like it was carved out of a solid chunk of wood, and where the grain runs through the wood, it now produces circles. And so the ball looks a lot like, I'll bet it will look better if we make it a little bit shiny. There we go. Now it looks like a cue ball. So here's a beautiful sphere that we made in Blender. It actually has a very low vertex count. It's a single prim, and it can be textured with this very beautiful wood grain texture. And as it turns out, this trick could be used for some stone textures. In the case of this granite texture, it has a bit of a stretch mark around the middle, and that's not as attractive as it could be. So this works better for wood than for some stone textures. It also should look good with some other textures you might not think to use, like bricks. So there, it kind of looks like we glued a bunch of bricks together, and then we carved this shape out of the bricks. Let's go back to Blender. I'm going to throw this away, this object away. I'm going to import a table that I have. There it is. So here's a table, and I'm going to show you that this wood grain trick works on more complicated objects, like even this table. So I'm going to look at the table from an odd angle. And you might want to experiment with looking at it at different angles, looking at it in perspective mode or in orthographic mode. But the trick is that you want to look at the table from an odd angle. Looking at it straight on is going to cause the wood grain to just run straight up and down in the corners, whereas looking at an angle produces a nice effect. First, we have to select the whole object. Then we project from view with bounds, and we get a UV map that is a projection of our object, and then we can export it back out, table, and we're done. So this is the perfect Blender bite. We got into Blender, we loaded an object, we made a simple change to it, we saved it back out again, and we're done. But now we want to see what this table looks like in World. Upload, mesh model, table. There's the table. We probably should set the level of detail, but we're just going to load it. Oh, it still calls itself cube. So here's our table. I'm going to put the same color white, the same texture zebra. And there we have our table that in a simple step it has been textured. The top looks really marvelous. Oh, here. I think this would also look good with a little bit of shininess to it. Okay, now we've polished our table. The top of the table looks like a beautiful slab of wood. The legs have the texture running at a little bit of a funny angle. Actually, here's an in-world trick that some of you may know. We can rotate the texture to different angles until those legs look better. I think that the top still looks nice, and the legs have a more circular pattern to them. I think that looks great. But as you saw, the number of steps we had to do in Blender to get this great wood grain effect on even a complicated object were very few. So this is a neat trick that I use when I haven't had time to do a more complicated UV map. You can do a simple one in just a few seconds.